Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Sunday morning service. Om Stapakaya Dharmasya Sarvadharma Swarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, the establisher of Dharma, the embodiment of all spiritual paths, and the greatest of manifestations of God. Om Vishnurva Tripurantako Bhavatu Va Brahma Surendrothava Bhanurva Shashalakshanoth Bhagavan Buddhot Siddhotava Ragadvesha Visharti Moharahita Sattvanukampodyato Yasarvai Sahasamskrito Gunaganais Tasmai Namah Sarvada. The Supreme Reality and its messengers are known by various names in various traditions, but as for me, I offer my worship always to the one going by any name and belonging to any tradition, who is free from attachment and hatred, free from worldliness and delusion, who is filled with compassion towards all living beings, and who is possessed of all noble virtues. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, Peace, Peace be unto us all. So most of you know the first verse that I chanted, Stapakaya cha Dharmasya, that was written by Swami Vivekananda in honor of Sri Ramakrishna. And it was written independently by Swamiji, but it has come to be part of a hymn that he wrote to Sri Ramakrishna, Om Ring Ritam. Twamachalo, etc. One that we sing in the Arati at many of our centers throughout the world. But it was a verse that he wrote independently of that song, and then later it was attached to that. And so that it says that our salutations to Sri Ramakrishna, who was Stapakaya cha Dharmasya, who was the establisher of Dharma. And so that, of course, is a reference back to the Gita, where Sri Krishna says that yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyuthanam adharmasya tadatmanam srijamyaham. So whenever dharma declines and irreligion prevails, then I body myself forth for the establishment of dharma, for the protection of the good, the destruction of evil, etc. So Swami Vivekananda was referencing that verse in the Gita when writing this hymn to Sri Ramakrishna as one of those rare people who come at a particular time in history in order to reestablish Dharma. And as I've explained on various occasions under various titles, the word dharma is much too big for a single word like religion. Religion is a part of it, but dharma is that which supports the whole universe. And in fact, that's similar to the root meaning of religion, but religion has come to mean something, a particular aspect of life, one particular field of life. But dharma is that which supports everything. And so when that, it also refers to, as a part of that idea, it refers to the moral order according to which the universe is constructed, the moral order of the universe. And so morality in Vedanta is not doing something against what God likes and doesn't like. It has nothing to do with God liking certain things and not liking things and getting angry if we go against the rules that he's made for the universe. It's the way the universe is constructed. And is based on the idea of the underlying unity of the universe, that there's one reality out of which everything has come and in which it rests, and of which it is a manifestation. And so when we do things that break, disturb, or harm that underlying unity, then we're going against the nature of things. So when we hurt others, when we lie, when we cheat, when we steal, we're going against the natural order of things. And so religion or dharma, morality, is being in tune with the nature of the universe. And so it has everything from physical law up to moral and ethical and social law, up to spiritual law, and finally to the unity of the underlying reality itself, of which this is a manifestation. So all of that is contained within the idea of dharma. So when society in particular, human society, is out of tune with dharma, then the divine being manifests in human form in order to reestablish dharma, to bring human society back into harmony with the nature of the universe, for the welfare of humanity itself, for the welfare of the whole universe, not just humanity, first starting with humanity, but as we see, when we are out as a society, when we are out of tune with the nature of things, then we do harm to everything else, harm to the environment, to animals and plants, to the earth itself. So Swami Vivekananda was, in this verse, begins by Stapakaya to Dharmasya, to our salutations to him who is the establisher of dharma, and Sarva Dharma Swarupine, who is the embodiment of all dharmas. But here, the sense of dharma comes more to all paths. Everybody is on a spiritual path, whether they know it or not. Those of us who come here are, of course, consciously on a spiritual path, or trying to get onto a spiritual path. That's why we come to a place like this. But everybody, the thief, the murderer, the tyrant, everyone is on a spiritual path, whether they know it or not, because that is what is calling us forward. That's what's motivating all of our actions. But we do bad actions because of ignorance. And so Sri Ramakrishna, as the embodiment of all paths, means in that larger sense. He is the embodiment of the very urge towards reality which is motivating everyone. And in a smaller sense, he is the manifestation of all conscious spiritual paths as well, all religious paths. So both in that more specific sense and in the larger sense, which includes that. And then the Avatara Varishtaya, to the great, literally it means to the greatest of incarnations. I don't usually translate it that way because that can give rise to the idea of narrowness, that our incarnation is bigger than your incarnation. And what Swamiji meant, as he himself explained, was that Sri Ramakrishna was, in his estimation, the fullest manifestation of God. That he was one who, because he manifested in a way that embodied all religious traditions, he was the fullest manifestation of God who had come. But again, not in the sense that Sri Ramakrishna is better than everybody else, and therefore we who are devotees of Sri Ramakrishna are better than others. No, nothing to do with that. But in the sense that Sri Ramakrishna was the fullest manifestation of the divine being. In fact, our Shobha here, she pointed out to me in Vedanta Kesari that a quotation from Swami Vignanananda, very interesting and pregnant with meaning, quotation from Swami Vignanananda, who is back there, I think the last one there in the row, direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. He was asked about Sri Ramakrishna being an incarnation. He said, no. Swami Vivekananda was the incarnation, the avatara. Sri Ramakrishna was that out of which incarnations come. And he wasn't just saying that just to praise Sri Ramakrishna, that was his conviction, that Swami Vivekananda was the incarnation, and Sri Ramakrishna is that out of which incarnations come. So salutations to Sri Ramakrishna, the establisher of Dharma in that comprehensive sense, the embodiment of all paths in that comprehensive as well as the more specific sense. In the sense of all paths, of all beings are searching towards that, and also in their own ways, and also in the specific sense of religious paths, and the fullest manifestation of the divine. And then the second verse that I recited is one that I often recite. Those of you who have are familiar with the center and with my talks will have heard it many times. The Supreme Reality and its messengers are known by various names in various traditions. But as for me, I offer my worship always to the one going by any name and belonging to any tradition, who is free from attachment and hatred, free from worldliness and delusion, filled with compassion towards all living beings, and possessed of all noble virtues. And that is the essence of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. This is an ancient verse, not from the Vedas, or in fact, many people ask me where it's from. No one that I have ever met knows where it's from. It's just Swami Yatishwaranandaji. He found it and included it in his book of universal prayers. And he just says traditional, meaning that he didn't know where it came from. But it's a beautiful verse because it states what religion is in the view of Hinduism, the essence of religion. It's not creeds and dogmas. It's not labels like what sampradaya do you belong to. All of that is fine, but that's not what religion is about. Those are ways to get into religion. But religion is about I worship always the one by any name and any belonging to any tradition who is free from attachment and hatred, free from worldliness and delusion, who is filled with compassion towards all living beings, and who is possessed of all noble virtues. And so that, according to Sri Ramakrishna and according to the larger Hindu tradition, that's what religion is. It's not about scriptures. As Swami Vivekananda used to say, that Vedanta is the only religion in the world where the scriptures themselves say it's not through the scriptures that you attain to God. It's the only scriptures which deny their own absolute nature. And it's through the transformation of the human heart and mind that religion is successful. So the topic this morning is Sri Ramakrishna, the universal. And so what I've just said explains the basis for that idea of Sri Ramakrishna, the universal. And I'm speaking on Sri Ramakrishna today because his birthday comes on Friday, March 4th, the actual day according to the Indian calendar. And we will celebrate it on Saturday, March 5th. But the next day, next Sunday, we won't have a lecture. So I wanted to speak on Sri Ramakrishna today so that so much time would not pass before there was another opportunity to give a Sunday lecture on him. So let me read a few passages that are taken from the same time, most of them from the same day, of what Swami Vivekananda said when establishing Belur Mutt about Sri Ramakrishna. He said, "Know it for certain that Sri Ramakrishna will keep his seat fixed here at Belur Mutt. Will keep his seat fixed here for the welfare of the many, Bahujana Hitaya, Bahujana Sukhaya, for the welfare of the many, for the happiness of the many, as the Buddha said, and which Swami Vivekananda often recited. So know it for certain that Sri Ramakrishna will keep his seat fixed here at Belur Mutt for the welfare of the many, Bahujana Hitaya, Bahujana Sukhaya, for a long time to come." Then again he said, "Just as Sri Ramakrishna held highly liberal views, this mutt, Belur Mutt, and its branches, too, will be a center for propagating similar ideas, that is, universal ideas. The blazing light of universal harmony that will emanate from here will flood the whole world." Swamiji said again about Belur Mutt. It, Bellarmine, will be a center in which, this is another statement at around the same time, it will be a center in which will be recognized and practiced a grand harmony of all creeds and faiths, as exemplified in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. And only ideas of religion in its universal aspect will be preached. From this center of universal toleration will go forth the shining message of goodwill and peace to all, and harmony to deluge the whole world. And then finally, he also said, "Do you all, my brothers," again addressing the monks at Bellarmine, "do you," and there were devotees there also, the monks and devotees who had gathered for the inauguration of Bellarmine. "Do you all, my brothers, pray to the Lord with all your heart and soul, that he, the divine incarnation of the age, may bless this place with his hallowed presence forever and ever, and make it a unique center, a Punya Kshetra, a holy place, of the harmony of all the different religions and sects, for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many." So all of these statements of Swamiji indicate that Bellarmine would be a center where Sri Ramakrishna would continue to reside. In fact, Swamiji said, not in what I read, but elsewhere, he said that Sri Ramakrishna, in fact, on the same day, he said that Sri Ramakrishna said that wherever I would carry him on my shoulder, there he would remain. And so he carried Sri Ramakrishna's ashes on his shoulder to establish them at Bellarmine, the new monastery which had been purchased. And he said that Sri Ramakrishna will remain here for a long, long time. And in what I read, he says that from this center will radiate universal ideas that will spread over the world, go forth from this center and spread over the world with the blessings of peace and harmony for all. And so Swami Vivekananda always saw Sri Ramakrishna in this vast sense. He never saw him in any small and narrow sense. And whenever he saw any of the other disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, monastic and lay, he saw them interpreting Sri Ramakrishna in a narrow way, even his most beloved of brothers. He would scold them severely, not, as people sometimes get the wrong idea, not because he was a hothead, but because he knew the importance that whatever was done at the beginning of the movement, that would go on growing and manifesting. And if he allowed narrow ideas to circulate about Sri Ramakrishna and be authenticated by other disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, then those would grow and would discolor the movement for ages to come. And so he always fought against any narrow idea of Sri Ramakrishna. One of the beautiful statements of that you can find in Swamiji's life at the first meeting of the Ramakrishna mission when it was established at Balaram Babu's house, Balaram Basu's house. And Swami Yogananda questioned Swamiji's methods of work. And then Swamiji laid into Swami Yogananda with very, very strong terms. Again, not because he was a hothead, but because he saw that these ideas had to be destroyed so that Sri Ramakrishna would not be interpreted in a narrow sectarian way. Having seen what has happened in world history, where great teachers' messages have all been interpreted in narrow and sectarian ways. So Swami Vivekananda wanted to avoid that. And he told Swami Yogananda, among many other things, again, it's well worth going and reading, but among other things, he said, whatever Sri Ramakrishna said to you, follow that. That will be good for you. But don't think that thereby you have understood Sri Ramakrishna. He was much greater than any of your ideas. And I won't allow such ideas to narrow our view of Sri Ramakrishna. So Swami Vivekananda was also, you find in the complete works, he was often criticizing ritual, puja, etc. Why? Not because he was against it. He himself established Durga Puja at Belar Math. He established regular daily worship at Belar Math and at other centers except for Mayavati in the Himalayas. But what he was afraid of was that Sri Ramakrishna would, as happens in religions around the world, he would be locked up in a temple. And temple priests or swamis as priests would control access to him. And it would become just another conventional religion where people come to get blessings, and the Swami comes out and waves the arati light around your new car or your new motorcycle, takes money to give blessings to your children so that they get good grades, and so it just becomes a vending machine for good luck. That's what religion is in most places. It's just a vending machine for good luck. You go give some money, you get some blessings, and think that thereby everything's going to go fine, as if God was so foolish. So Swamiji he said, don't let this become a Thakur body, a regular temple. So he was always afraid of that. And he was afraid that ritualism has a tendency to take over. And again, not because he was against it. He recognized the beauty of it. And in my own life, one of the most wonderful periods of my life, spiritually speaking, was when I was in San Diego and for 11 years did puja every day. It was a great blessing to be able to do that, a full puja every day for 11 years. But again, one of the problems with ritualism is that you find that those who do ritual, and I've seen this many times myself among people, those who do ritual, they become sort of a separate class from the rest. Oh, he does Sri Ramakrishna's puja. He's very special. He's not like the other Swamis, so we must go and make pranam to him because he's the one who does Sri Ramakrishna's puja. He's got special access to Sri Ramakrishna. No, he just does the puja. Others are doing other types of service to Sri Ramakrishna. But there's this awe of mystery around the puja and the people who do puja, and that leads to all kinds of abuses and as well as misunderstandings. So Swami Vivekananda was afraid that that would happen in the name of Sri Ramakrishna. So it used to be at Belar Math, the headquarters, if one wanted to start a new temple or a new center, to get permission to build a temple was extremely difficult. They didn't give permission to build temples. They said, just have a small shrine room. That's all you need. But we're not here to build temples. Nowadays, it's become common, for good or for bad, but that's become common in the order. But for many decades, it was very difficult to get permission to build a temple. They were just mostly shrine rooms or a small chapel. And it was for that reason. So, again, coming back to the topic, Swamiji says that this will be a center where Sri Ramakrishna's universal ideas will spread over the world. So what will those ideas be? Well, that we will only know fully, or not even fully, but we will know to a much better extent as time goes on, as those ideas do spread and they become visible and they begin to manifest. So today I only want to speak about some of the ideas as we can see them now. But first I want to say a few words about how strange it is that Sri Ramakrishna, that Swamiji saw in Sri Ramakrishna such a universal figure. Because if you look at his background, you find that everything in his background was narrow and limited. He was born in a small little village, far separated from the modern world, a village which was far in those days because of the difficulty of travel and communication. It was far from Calcutta, only about 60 kilometers straight, but a world away in distance at that time. So he was born into a small village which had no touch of the English who were taking over the country. It had no influence of the modern world whatsoever. And he was born into a Brahmin family where everything was hemmed in by observances and rules of how to lead your life, how to do everything, hemmed in by tradition on all sides. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but in the sense that as far as his experience of the larger world and ways of living and different people and all of that, he had none of that. He was exposed to very little as a child. His family was very orthodox. And then he goes to Calcutta, but even there, he had little contact with the larger world, partly because he lived again within his world of Orthodox observance in the beginning when he went there. Then he took a job as a temple priest and passed his days in spiritual practice for 12 years. Years in which he didn't even sleep, he said, for 12 years. So intense was his spiritual practice that day and night he was yearning for God. And so even though Calcutta was beginning to become a city in the modern sense and beginning to become the center of the British Empire, that had little or no influence over him. So his work also was something that was concerned with the growth of the daily rituals in the temple, the traditional temples, which had been the traditional rituals, which had been done for a couple of thousand years, the tantric rituals, and of course their roots went back thousands of years to the Vedas, and except for Mathur Babu, who was somewhat influenced by modern English ideas. He had very little contact with anything to do with the British. Science was unknown to him, except what he saw in Mathur Babu, who had something of a modern education. And yet, all through his life, we find this tendency towards the universal, in spite of the fact that he had a very restricted upbringing. And that's not completely surprising if we recognize the fact that a great mind, one of the things that characterizes a great mind is that they can see the universal within the particular. And I don't mean the universal meaning Brahman, but they can see a larger significance in the individual things. They see the things that tie ideas together. They see the larger principles which make things work. And so Sri Ramakrishna, though he avoided modern education, which he called breadwinning education, and even the traditional education in Kamarpukur he avoided because he said that he saw people were just getting an education so that they could make money and have a happy, ordinary life. So he said, I don't want a breadwinning education. An education, as he said, for bundling plantains, bundling bananas. So he, in his later life, however, he began, as his disciples began to come, and first starting with Keshav Chandra Sen and the Brahmo devotees, and then as his own disciples began to come, his own close disciples began to come, he began to have more contact with the modern world through them. And with Mathur Babu, he had traveled over North India and seen various things in North India. But even then, though he was extremely observant, but he was a little touched by the modern world until his disciples began to come. And yet all through his life, we find that tendency towards the universal. We see at his very birth that his father had a vision of Vishnu wanting to be born as his son, and his mother having a vision of Shiva entering into her womb. And so he was both the incarnation of Vishnu and of Shiva. His mother had visions day and night of many deities, some she knew of and some she had never seen or imagined, would come before her and bow before her as the mother of a coming great soul. And then at his home, though his parents were very traditional and very orthodox, they had several different deities. They worshipped Shiva as well as Vishnu. They worshipped Rama as well as the goddess Shitala, etc. And so there was a religious liberality at home, unlike some of the narrowness that prevailed in villages in those days. And then he, from childhood, he insisted on understanding rather than just following instructions blindly. He insisted on knowing why. There's the famous example, or the well-known example, I should say, for those who have read Sri Ramakrishna's life, of when he and other kids would go to the bathing ghat where the women would bathe and splash and make noise and annoy the women. And they tried to drive them away, but the kids, that made them more, they enjoyed it even more, as we see with kids everywhere. So finally, the women went to his mother and complained. And so his mother called him and told him not to go and bother the women. And he asked why. And she said, because you shouldn't see women bathing. And so then he went, that's all she said. So he went for several days, hid in the bushes and watched the women as they were bathing, and then came to his mother and said, so today I watched the women bathing. Yesterday I saw them. The day before also I saw them, and nothing has happened. And so then the mother explained, no, but they will feel insulted, as I would feel insulted also when I'm taking my bath if people are looking at me. So don't think of them as me. And then Sri Ramakrishna understood that. And so always he insisted on understanding the why of things, which also shows a tendency towards a mind that understands the universal. Sri Ramakrishna, as I already mentioned, he resisted ordinary education because he said it's just a breadwinning education. I want that education which will allow me to see reality, to see God, to see that which is real. And so here also we see that he had that ability to see behind the obvious, to see behind the surface of things, to see the purpose of something, and to know that that's not the purpose that I want to devote my life to. I want to devote my life to something which is higher than that. So again, in many, many ways, we see that even in his childhood, in spite of a very restricted upbringing, he had a mind that tended towards the universal. Swami Vivekananda once said that if I had my education to do over and I had any say in the matter, then I would emphasize learning how to control the mind so that then I could take facts as I wanted. He said that people waste so much time trying to learn because they lack the power of concentration. So I would emphasize learning the power of concentration, learning to control the mind. And that's what Sri Ramakrishna did. Swamiji said that people have so much difficulty learning because the minds are just a jumble of undigested ideas. But if we had the power to control the mind, the power to focus on the mind, then we could absorb ideas easily at will. And so that, again, is what Sri Ramakrishna did. He always sought the experiential, not just the conceptual. He sought that which was behind the surface. He had the tremendous powers of observation, which we see all through his life. Later in his teaching life, his parables show how carefully he observed village life when he went on pilgrimage to different parts of India. His observations of the way people lived and the differences among the people was very, very sharp. So he had that tremendous power of observation and the ability to connect what he saw to higher principles. That we always see his ability. So as a spiritual aspirant, when he began to, after he took the job as temple priest, when he began to be possessed with this idea, Mother Kali, are you real? Or are you just a clay image? Then he began to seek for that which was behind the form, to seek that which was behind the image, to seek the reality. And so he began to, after realizing the Divine Mother, he began to see what other ways can God be experienced. The ordinary spiritual aspirant spends their whole life trying to realize God in one aspect. And maybe they make some progress, and a few attain to the fruit of that practice, and then they live their life in a state of union with God, and that's the end of their spiritual life. The rest is just the enjoying the fruit of their realization. But Sri Ramakrishna, even after realization, he tried path after path to see what were the different ways that God could be experienced. Again, showing that extraordinary search for the universal. And then when he had experiences, the many cases recorded where he saw the deity or the incarnation, as the case might be, merging into himself. And so in that way, he began to see himself not as a person. We see ourselves as little people, but he saw himself as as an embodiment of principle. And he was extraordinary in that sense as well. He had an unusual ability to extrapolate from one experience to a larger experience outside of his own. For instance, after following so many different disciplines of Hinduism and Christianity and Islam, then he had a deep understanding of Sikhism and of Buddhism, as is revealed in his teachings. He had a deep understanding of both, and of the essential truths of both. So he had that, again, ability to see beyond the particular to the universal. And after his attainment of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he realized Brahman, the universal principle, the one truth which expresses itself as this universe. So he realized that by knowing which everything here becomes known. As the Mundaka Upanishad begins with the question, what is that by knowing which everything here can be known? He realized that by which everything here can be understood, the principle out of which everything here is a manifestation. So he identified with that. But he didn't stop even there. He went beyond that to what he called the state of Vignana, where when he returned to this universe, he saw this universe as non-different from Brahman itself. This universe was just an appearance of that very reality. So there was no longer even a duality between knowledge and ignorance, between Brahman and Maya. He saw everything as pervaded by the ultimate reality. So whether he was in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, where the universe didn't exist, or whether he came back to this plane and saw the universe, he saw everything as divine, every particular and the whole itself. And through that, he identified, as Swami Sardananda explains in Leela Prasanga, or the Great Master, or Sri Ramakrishna and his divine play, known by all of those names, the biography of Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Sardananda explains that he entered Bhava Mukha, the state of identity with the cosmic mind, where remaining on the edge of the absolute, knowing his identity with Brahman, but looking into the universe, he identified with the cosmic mind, the source of all ideas and the source of the universe itself. So he was at the very source of universality itself. And then when we come to his teaching, he was able to teach to every individual in the way that they could understand. Because through identity with the cosmic mind, he could see each individual, their past, present, and future, could see the constructs of their mind, the very structure of their minds, and their way of understanding. And so therefore he could teach in the terms that that person could understand. Swami Vivekananda said that Sri Ramakrishna was the first great world teacher who had the courage to speak in everyone's language, the language of everyone. Not meaning Swahili and Chinese and Japanese and Korean, no, but meaning in terms that everyone could understand, in the terms of the person's character and tendencies. And he taught all. He taught all who came to him. There were Christians who came to him, people from all different sects who came to him. The Sikhs would famously come to see him and then walk away telling the other disciples, he belongs to us, not to you. He's one of ours. Because they found in him the embodiment of their own tradition. And so he was amazing in his universality there in that way. And that has continued to the present day. So that over the past century, our Vedanta societies, not here yet, but in many of our other societies, we've had actual formal members of the society who were Christian ministers, Protestant ministers. I've known several myself, or Catholic priests. I've known some Catholic nuns, Jewish rabbis. I've known some. I helped one rabbi to get initiation from Swami Swahananda, and he's still a famous rabbi. Muslims, Buddhists, people of all traditions have been members and active in our societies, so that universality has continued. And the great master which I referred to, the biography by Swami Saradananda, also known as the Leela Prasanga in Bengali and Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play in a new translation, is an encyclopedia of religion. An encyclopedia of religion, an encyclopedia of spiritual practice, an encyclopedia of religious experience. So again, in all of these ways, we see that though his background was very restricted, and by that I don't mean anything bad, that was part of who he was, and that was that which gave him his formation and formed his character. But he didn't remain within the confines of that traditional upbringing. He expanded far beyond it and became a universal person, in spite of the limitations of his contacts and so forth, because of the extraordinary nature of his mind. So let me say a little bit about a few of his universal ideas. Much more we'll understand with time, and there's much more that could be said in a longer talk. But I'll just mention a few of his ideas that are important and things that are known to you. But let me say again, as I said at the beginning, that the larger part of his work was hidden, as was Swami Vivekananda's work. Both of them worked at the foundations of the world. They worked at the foundations of the cosmic mind. They worked at the foundations of human history. What they did was, as Swami, in the metaphor that Swami Vivekananda used, he had put in a lever for the good of humanity, that is, to change the direction of the world. So their primary work was at levels that we can't see, unless we could see the cosmic mind itself and realize there what it was that they did to give a push to society and to world history as a whole. But what we can see, first and foremost, of course, he, as I already said, having realized Brahman, and then having realized the Vignana state, which is even beyond that, where even Maya becomes illuminated and is seen as the reality itself. He saw everything as Brahman. He saw everything as God. And for him, there was no distinction between God, the personal God to whom we worship and pray, and Brahman. Yes, one is the absolute and the other is that same absolute in communion with the universe, as seen within the universe, but the reality is the same. And so he saw everything as Brahman, he saw everything as God. And that universalized every particular to him. Everything in the universe reminded him of the divine, because he saw the divine within everything, which he expressed in various ways. He said that just as pillows floating on the ocean, he saw everything here as just forms floating on the ocean, or as bubbles or nothing but water. So everything here were just bubbles of divinity. So that universalized everything to him. He saw the depth of everything and the divinity of everything. And then, of course, there's the well-known, most well-known with him, harmony of religions, which he realized in his own life and taught throughout his life. He always tried to take people beyond any narrow idea of religion. When people would come to him and he would ask them what their ideal was, how they like to think of God, whatever the person would say, Sri Ramakrishna would say, that's good, go forward. But always remember that God is infinitely beyond that conception. That's one conception, but God has infinite manifestations. So he would always encourage people to go beyond limitations, to follow what was meaningful to them, but not to restrict God to anything in particular. And he went further than that because he saw the universality of religion, that religion was the one purpose of human life. Now, most people in the world don't recognize that. They're not interested in that. They're not going to follow it, even if you tell them. And that's okay. You can't force religion on anyone. But Sri Ramakrishna saw that everyone was motivated by that everyone does what they do because of that motivation, seeking the infinite, even when they don't know it. And so that also universalized his experience of humanity and beyond humanity to all of life, even material creation. That's why Swami Vivekananda said, based on that idea, that always remember man does not travel from error to truth, but from truth to truth. From lower truth to higher truth, if you will, but from truth to truth. That is, everyone is seeing the same reality, but interpreting it differently. But everything is a vision of reality. Everything is an understanding of reality. It's just some are more limited than other visions of reality. And so that Sri Ramakrishna had realized. So he universalized religion. And he universalized values, the values of renunciation and detachment. That those were not just for monastics, those were for everyone, uh, just to lead a normal life, even if you're not interested in religion. We have to learn some detachment and renunciation just to lead a happy, ordinary life. In order to be able to free the mind from the things that torment the mind, because we can't free the mind from it. We can't just say, okay, stop thinking about it. You're not doing anything by thinking about it, just stop. But the mind doesn't stop. The mind just goes on and on, playing the tape over and over and over. Why did he say that to me? I'm going to get that. And of course, we know we're never going to do anything, but we just go on, he told me this, and why did he tell me that? I didn't do anything wrong. Okay, so now you've got it figured out. No, then you go over the same thing. Why did he tell me this? I'm not going to let him get away with this. I should have told him. And it goes on and on and on and on. We can't get over it. So even to lead a happy life, an ordinary life, forget religion. Detachment and renunciation are keys. There's nothing extraordinary about them. It's just that when you come, if you want higher spiritual life, then you practice it more consciously and more deliberately and in a more complete manner. But you're doing the same thing everyone has to do just in order to lead a happy life. And so he universalized the values. He showed that spiritual life is both for householders and for those who decide to renounce the world. The spiritual life is for everyone, and not limited to just the idea that some had traditionally, and some still have, that, oh, well, I'm a householder. I can't do anything. What can I do? Maybe my next life I'll be a monk and I'll go off to the Himalayas and I'll meditate in a cave, but I'm just a householder. What can I do? No, spiritual life is for everybody. If you want it. If you don't want it, you're still following a spiritual life without knowing it. It's just that you don't know it, and so you're following it sort of blindly. But it's for everyone. Um, and he embodied universal love for all. Some people say, well, there were people that he didn't encourage to come to him, but that's because he realized that not everybody is interested. It's not that he had hatred for anyone, it's that there are people that would come to see him and he would immediately recognize that these are people who have no spiritual interest. So you'd say, well, why don't you go see the temple garden? Or people would come to him and ask him for some medicine, and he realized that they're only interested in medicine, they're not interested in spirituality. He would say, well, go visit Baba so-and-so in the garden. He knows all of those things. I don't know anything. So that's true. But that wasn't because he hated people or looked down on people. It was because he recognized that until a person is hungering for God, there's no sense in giving them spiritual instruction. And he also realized that he had generated this tremendous spiritual power and these realizations, which were for the good of humanity. And so he had to transmit them to those who were capable of carrying them forth and out into the world, rather than exhausting all of his energy on just anyone and everyone who wasn't interested in what he had to say. You see in the Christian Bible where a woman came and touched the hem of Jesus's robe, and it says that Jesus felt power draining from him, and he turned and saw that this woman had touched his robe, and he blessed her. But that shows that, yes, he felt the spiritual power draining from him. And so that's a reality for a spiritual teacher, even for an incarnation. And so he preserved that tremendous realization and power to transmit to the disciples who could carry it forth. But even then, he transmitted it to people like Girish Ghosh and Kalipada Ghosh, who had led very immoral lives. Girish Ghosh used to say, though certainly it was something of an exaggeration, said, there's no sin that I have not committed. Surely he could have thought of something he hadn't done, but that was his his bhava, his attitude. And then actresses like Binodini and others that Sri Ramakrishna blessed. So he accepted anyone who had any sincerity. He would take them to himself and bless them wholly and give them spiritual inspiration. So that universal love. He used to say that among bhaktas, there is no caste among bhaktas. And so as you see with Sri Rama, Sri Krishna, Sri Chaitanya, so with Sri Ramakrishna, he saw that the spiritual life was open to all, irrespective of their background and their station in society. But to truly understand Sri Ramakrishna fully in his universality, we come to Swamiji, because Swamiji was Sri Ramakrishna's message to the world. Holy Mother herself said that she saw Sri Ramakrishna speaking through Swamiji as Swamiji was teaching the world. She saw that it was Sri Ramakrishna that was working through Swamiji. When other disciples, direct disciples, even the great ones, Ishwara Kotis like Swami Premananda and Swami Yogananda, were doubtful about Swamiji and what he was doing and thought this is not what Sri Ramakrishna taught us, the Holy Mother said, no, it's Sri Ramakrishna himself who is speaking through Swamiji, who is getting this work done through him. When Master Mahashoy, the author of the Gospel, doubted, even years later, the Holy Mother said, no, what Swamiji is teaching, that is Sri Ramakrishna's own work. So in Swami Vivekananda, we see the universal message of Sri Ramakrishna. And we have to remember that Sri Ramakrishna carefully trained Swami Vivekananda. Other disciples said that Sri Ramakrishna would take him apart and teach him how to both form the order and how to teach the world. Sri Ramakrishna trained him in that. And so there we find, when Swami Vivekananda speaks of Sri Ramakrishna, we find great depth and universality to what he says about Sri Ramakrishna. In that beautiful hymn that we sing at Arati time, Kandana Bhava Bandhana, the Bengali hymn, but the words are Sanskritic words, and so people from any background with a Sanskritic language, whether it's Marathi or Gujarati or Hindi or Bengali or Assamese, etc., they can understand the words, but it's actually written in Bengali. But he doesn't even mention the name of Sri Ramakrishna. It's all just the principles of that which Sri Ramakrishna was. You find universal and a universal interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Ashokananda, one of our great Swamis, he used to say that the Kandana Bhava Bandhana could be sung to any incarnation because of its universal nature. So that was Swamiji's understanding of Sri Ramakrishna. So let me just go over one of his hymns on Sri Ramakrishna are wonderful. Om Ring Ritam Kandana Bhava Bandhana. And then there's one that I'm especially fond of, Achandala Pratihatarayo Yasya Prema Pravaha. I'll just give English translation because of time. He who was Rama, whose irresistible stream of love flowed even to the pariah, who, though transcending the world, was ever engaged in the world's welfare, whose greatness is unequaled in the three worlds, Sita's beloved, who was like knowledge, clothed in Sita-like devotion. So what's coming is Sri Swamiji in the first verse is speaking of Ram, the incarnation, in universal terms. And the second, which I'll read now, he's speaking of Sri Krishna in universal terms. And then he says that Sri Ramakrishna was the embodiment of both. As Sri Ramakrishna had said, he who is Rama and he who is Krishna is born again in this as Ramakrishna. So he who is Krishna, who quelled the tumult, terrible like the sound of cosmic destruction, arising from the great battle of Kurukshetra, who destroyed the dreadful night of primeval ignorance, and who roared with the voice of a lion, the sweet and calming Gita. That renowned soul is now born as Sri Ramakrishna. So again, he who is Rama, with the beautiful words he said, and he who is Krishna with the beautiful words, that renowned soul is now born as Ramakrishna. And then there's the refrain in two verses. Naradeva Deva, Naradeva Deva, Jaya Jaya Naradeva, Naradeva Deva, Jaya Jaya Naradeva, and then Shakti Samudrama, Samutta Tarangam. So hail God-man, victory unto you. I surrender myself to the Guru, that is Sri Ramakrishna, the physician for the malady of relative existence, who is a wave rising in the ocean of Shakti, who has made manifest the play of divine love, and who is the great weapon destroying the demon of doubt. Samshaya Rakshasa Nasha Mahastram, the great weapon which destroys the demon of doubt. So to the Guru, the physician for the malady of relative existence, a wave rising in the ocean of Shakti, who has made manifest the play of divine love, etc. So again, seeing Sri Ramakrishna in universal terms, and then again, Naradeva Deva, Jaya Jaya Naradeva. Hail God-man, victory, victory unto you. I surrender myself to the Guru, the physician for the malady of relative existence, whose mind was identified with the non-dualistic truth, Advaya Tattva Samahita Chittam. So whose mind was identified with the non-dual truth. Whose person was wrapped in the cloth of supreme devotion, Projwala Bhakti Patavrita Vrittam, whose person was wrapped in the cloth of supreme devotion. So his mind was identified with the non-dual truth, and he was clothed in the cloth of supreme devotion, whose body was work itself, Karma Kaleva Madbhuta Cheshtam, whose body was work itself given for the welfare of humanity, and whose deeds were extraordinary, Adbhuta Cheshtam. So we don't often think of Sri Ramakrishna as a karma yogi. We think of him as someone who is a great bhakta, who had jnana also, and who was a great yogi, capable of complete control of the mind, always absorbed in the divine. But actually, Sri Ramakrishna was the embodiment of karma yoga as well, which Sri Swamiji says here, whose body was work itself, karma kalevaram, and whose all of whose efforts were extraordinary, adbhuta cheshtam. In his last illness, when he couldn't speak without extraordinary pain, he couldn't eat anything, he couldn't swallow, and yet when people would come to him, he would teach them. Even to his last day, he was gasping out teachings to people. He never ceased working. When you read the gospel and see that day and night, his room was always open to everyone. His room was always open. People were always coming and going. Individuals would come, groups would come, crowds on some days would come on the weekends. And he never had any rest, never had any time for himself. He was always available to everyone, and even in his last illness. And so his deeds were extraordinary. The careful training he gave to the direct disciples, and the special training he gave to Swami Vivekananda. So, and let me just, in closing, let me now give a few words of conclusion, but let me just read another poem of Swamiji's to Sri Ramakrishna, which is rarely used, and I've never known why. It's an extraordinary poem. But again, I'll just read the English. We shall crush the stars to atoms and unhinge the universe. Know you not who we are? We are the servants of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna Dasavayam. We are the servants of Sri Ramakrishna. We shall crush the stars to atoms and unhinge the universe. That is, because we are the servants of Sri Ramakrishna, nothing is impossible to us. We are weak and lowly, cry piteous fools, but they are faithless, thinking themselves bodies. We heroes tremble no more, gaining the state beyond fear. This is the faith we choose, we, the servants of Ramakrishna. Drinking constantly, drinking the supreme nectar of immortality, while giving up attachment to the world, forever discarding that self-seeking spirit, the mother of all dissension, ever meditating on the blessed feet of our Guru, the embodiment of all well-being. Bowing, repeatedly bowing in reverence, we invite the whole world to partake of this nectar. Churned from the beginningless treasurer, the ocean of the Vedas, filled with the strength of the Devas, Hari, Hara, Brahma, and all, charged with the life essence of all the avatars, gods incarnate on earth. Behold that nectar. Sri Ramakrishna is its container in full. So again, his view of Sri Ramakrishna was nothing less than the universal itself made manifest in human form. And his effort always was to try to be true to that universal spirit of Sri Ramakrishna, that spirit which had condemnation for none, but encouragement for all. That spirit which saw the universal within everything, and saw within every human striving the effort to attain to the supreme. And so in him and in Swami Vivekananda, who gave voice to his message to the world, we see the universal in human form and nothing less than that. So let me conclude here. And I'll give announcements. If there are one or two questions, I won't take many, but if there are one or two questions, I will take those, but after the announcements. Announcements on Tuesday, we have Shivaratri. It's the actual day, according to the Indian calendar, for Shivaratri. And we will observe that here at 7 o'clock until 6:30 in the temple with the Shivaratri Puja. All those who are fully vaccinated are welcome to come. You don't have to register. It's open for you to come to Shivaratri. We just ask that you wear a mask while you're here at the puja. Then on Thursday, we will have the gospel class as usual at 11 o'clock, Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. On Saturday, we will have the birth anniversary puja of Sri Ramakrishna. Again, his birthday, according to the Indian calendar, is Friday, but so that more people can come, we'll celebrate it on Saturday. And that will begin at 10:30 and go till about 12:30. And so everyone is invited to that as well, those who are fully vaccinated. We won't have the usual tent outside with everyone seated for prasad, again, because of the COVID restrictions, but we will give everyone a box of prasad to take with them. So you're all invited to that. And then the rest of then in March, the rest of March, the classes will continue as usual. And then in April, on April 1st, Swami Sarvadevananda will be coming after 3 years. On April 2nd, Saturday morning, he'll be giving initiation to those who want initiation, spiritual initiation. If anyone wants initiation that has not spoken to me in the last month or so, they should come to me. And we'll make arrangements. And then on Sunday, April 3rd, we will have a formal inauguration of the new retreat up in Trinity. So that will be after Sri Ramakrishna's birthday. We'll be sending out a flyer about that. So those are the announcements for now. So, let me first get yours, Ajay. Question?
You see the word for it, the war that's going on. Ramakrishna is one teaching the universal principle of kindness, love and compassion. Where do you see the war that's a good word that is fine?
Yes, so the question for those of you all listening online who couldn't hear the question, we see the world, this present situation in between Ukraine and Russia, the fighting and so forth, and then we see Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda's message of universal love and harmony and so forth. Where is the world going now? And of course, that's a frequent question that people have. Those who are familiar with Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji, that they taught one thing and we see the world going in a different direction. Does it mean that their teaching has no effect? Swamiji himself said that he thought it would take generations before the fraternity of humankind, the brotherhood, sisterhood of human beings, would become a reality. He said that there were still so many things, so many forces in the world that had to work themselves out, that it would take generations before they would work themselves out. But the message which they gave, Swamiji also said that would be fully dynamic within the world for the next 1,500 years. So it's just beginning like a seed beginning to sprout, which eventually becomes a huge banyan tree, which gives shade to thousands of people. But it begins as a tiny, tiny sprout. So their teaching, their work is sprouting. It is effective for some of us. It hasn't yet changed the whole direction of the world, but that's because it takes time, because of the scale on which we're speaking. It's like I had never even thought of it as a question, but once I understood the solution, I understood why it should have been a question. Why is it that the winter solstice is in late December, and yet that's the darkest night of the year, as we know, or the darkest day of the year, but it's in January or February, late January or early February, which is usually the coldest period of the year. And so in the summer, the brightest day of the year is in late June, and yet it's usually August or September that we get the greatest heat. You would think it would be on the solstice. No, that's because you're talking about the whole world system with the huge atmosphere, the oceans, and all of that. So there's a delay between the darkest and the brightest day and the effect of it. And so with human history, you're talking about gigantic forces. And so Swamiji said he had put in a lever for the good of humankind, but that will take time for it to manifest. So what we can do is to look to the sunrise because we know it's coming. If we have faith in Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna, not blind faith, but because we've studied their lives and see the quality of people they were. And so what they said must have meaning. And by people imbibing those values ourselves, gradually that is changing the world. It starts from a few people to more people to more people to more people. Gradually, these ideas will spread and will affect the world at large. So let me take these because it's over time, Suranjit. So let me take this question here. Could you please say something about the meaning of Sri Ramakrishna giving ecstasy to those at Kasipur Garden? Yes, that was at what we call Kalpataru Day, the day when Sri Ramakrishna manifested himself to his devotees in a way similar, not the same, but equivalent to Jesus's transfiguration when he showed his divine nature to his disciples. And so Sri Ramakrishna awakened the spirituality of those who were present. And so that also Sri Ramakrishna became, it's called the Kalpataru, the wish-fulfilling tree. But as Swami Sardananda says, it was not really the Kalpataru, because the Kalpataru, the mythological wish-fulfilling tree in Indian lore, is like the Aladdin's lamp or the jewel which grants all wishes or whatever in different mythologies of different cultures. Whatever you desire, good or bad, it will give to you. But Sri Ramakrishna wasn't like that. He awakened the spiritual consciousness of those around him. And so he revealed himself to be in that the divine being who could awaken the spiritual consciousness of those who came to him. And so that was a historical incident, but we speak of it and we observe it on the 1st of January when it happened in 1886. We still observe it on the 1st of January because Sri Ramakrishna is still that. We can't go to him in Dakshineshwar and get his physical blessings by seeing him physically, but we can still go to him and know that he is still there, ready to awaken our spiritual consciousness when we're ready. When we're ready, he will still can, will, and does do that. So, okay, Surinji, let me, if it's a short question. Good question. So since this is not a Thakur body, that is a traditional temple where you come to pay the priest and get some blessings and things, how should we be worshiping Sri Ramakrishna? So the worship of Sri Ramakrishna is for the welfare of all. In fact, when we do the worship here, we say at the beginning, Sri Ramakrishna Devasya Parshada Bhakta Sri Jana Hridayeshu Nitya Lila Bhava Vikasanaya. May the divine play of Sri Ramakrishna be awakened in the hearts of his devotees and disciples. Nikila Janagana Madhye Tan Mahatmya Yasho Vridhaye. And may his glory be manifest in the hearts of all beings everywhere. And we do this for the awakening of devotion and knowledge. Bhakti Jnanodayaya Ayamaramba Kurmaha. We do this for the awakening of knowledge and devotion in the hearts of all. And so the idea of worship here is to establish a relationship with the divine, but always remembering that he's not just a deity on the altar. That we put clothes on and that we do the various service for. Even in our centers like Belar Mutt, where that is done, we have to remember that that is Sri Ramakrishna allows himself to be approached in that way so that we establish a sense of connection. And as Sri Ramakrishna said himself, wherever God is worshipped and prayed to, there's a special manifestation of God. And so we have temples in order to make God more visible to us ordinary people. Where God is everywhere, but how many can really understand that, and even fewer how many can feel that. And so we establish temples where God is worshipped, where people pray and so forth, so that it gradually over time builds up an atmosphere that people can feel when they come here. But that is for the welfare of all. It's not to keep it locked up here and protected from people where there's a priest or a Swami or somebody who is the gatekeeper, the key that only gives the select few access and so forth. No, it's in order to establish a place and a mood where spirituality is manifest. But that's so that we can grow beyond that. Swami Vivekananda always insisted that we have to go beyond that. If we still only see God in the image, then we haven't understood God or Sri Ramakrishna. That's only to help focus the mind, nothing more than that. So, okay. So with that, let me give a closing chant. Om madhuvatarithayate madhuksharanti sindhavaha madhvirnasantoshadhihi madhunaktamutoshasi madhumatparthivagum rajaha madhudyaurastu nah pita madhumando vanaspatir madhumagumastu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantunaha. Om madhu, om madhu, om madhu. For us who seek the truth, and for all living beings, may the winds blow sweetly. May the rivers flow sweetly. May the herbs yield us sweetness. Sweet be the night and the break of day. Sweet be the very dust of the earth. May the heavens pour down sweetness upon us. May the trees, lords of the forest, bear us sweetness. May the sun shed its sweetness upon us. May all the directions pour forth sweetness. Om, sweetness, sweetness, sweetness.